Hello, 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 hello. Welcome to Storytime with Moog. I am Moog, and today we are reading The Hill of Dreams by Arthur Machen, starting with Chapter 5. But first, anyway, let's get started. Let's do it. We are reading The Hill of Dreams by Arthur Machen, and it is a wild, beautifully written story. We're starting with chapter 5 today. So what has happened so far is we have our main character, Lucian, who doesn't really fit into society, never really did, even when he was in school. And he is just further and further retreating into his own imagination. And he is furthering his studies of literature and just anything odd. And the more odd and the more obscure and least likely way you can make money is what his hyper focus is. And at the start of the book, we are mostly in real life, and every once in a while we get into his imagination. And now we are fully in his imagination, and every once in a while we get a peek out into the real world of how people are observing him. And he is becoming more and more just like skin and bones because he's ignoring his own needs, and it is just beautiful. It's just beautiful. And the word choices are great. It is very much like a writer's or just like a love of language type book for people. It does a lot of almost meta descriptions of things. Like, for example, at the end or at the start of the second chapter, it says something about like enjoying the first chapter that he was reading or writing at that time. And it's like, oh, look at you now. Look at you. I see what you did there. I see what you did there, Arthur. We're on a first name basis. So yes, I'm enjoying it. But it is pretty obscure and out there. So, do it. Let's do it. Let's do it. Chapter 5. And he was, at last, in the city of the unending, murmuring streets, a part of the stirring shadow of the amber-lighted gloom. It seemed a long time since he had knelt before his sweetheart in the lane, the moonfire streaming upon them from the dark circle of the fort, the air and the light and his soul full of haunting, the touch of the unimaginable thrilling his heart. And now he sat in a terrible bed-sitting room in a western suburb, confronted by a heap and litter of papers on the desk of a battered old bureau. He had put his breakfast tray out on the landing and was thinking of the morning's work and of some very dubious pages that he had blackened the night before. But when he had lit his disreputable briar, he remembered there was an unopened letter waiting for him on the table. He had recognized the vague, staggering script of Miss Deacon, his cousin. There was not much news. His father was just the same as usual. There had been a good deal of rain. The farmers expected to make a lot of cider, and so forth. But at the close of the letter, Miss Deacon became useful for reproof and admonition. I was at Kerman on Tuesday, she said, and called on the Gervaises and the Dixons. Mr. Gervaise smiled when I told him you were a literary man, living in London, and said he was afraid you wouldn't find it a very practical career. Mrs. Gervaise was very proud of Henry's success. He passed 5th for some examination, and will begin with nearly 400 a year. I don't wonder the Gervaises are delighted. Then I went to the Dixons and had tea. Mrs. Dixon wanted to know if you had published anything yet, and I said I thought not. She showed me a book everybody is talking about called The Dog and the Doctor. She says it's selling by thousands, and that one can't take up a paper without seeing the author's name. She told me to tell you that you ought to try to write something like it. Then Mr. Dixon came in from the study, and your name was mentioned again. He said he was afraid you had made rather a mistake in trying to take up literature as if it were a profession, and seemed to think that a place in a house of business would be more suitable and more practical. He pointed out that you had not had the advantages of a university training, and said that you would find men who had made good friends and had the tone of the university, would be before you at every step. He said Edward was doing very well at Oxford. He writes to them that he knows several noblemen, and that young Philip Birmingham, son of John Bullingham, is his most intimate friend. Of course, this is very satisfactory for the Dixons. I am afraid, my dear Lucian, you have rather overrated your powers. Wouldn't it be better, even now, to look out for some real work to do, instead of wasting your time over these silly old books? I know quite well how the Gervaises and the Dixons feel. They think idleness so injurious for a young man, and likely to lead to bad habits. You know, my dear Lucian, I am only writing like this because of my affection for you, so I am sure, my dear boy, you won't be offended. Lucian pigeonholed the letter solemnly in the receptacle lettered Barbarians. He felt that he ought to ask himself some serious questions. Why haven't I passed 5th? Why isn't Philip, son of Sir John, my most intimate friend? Why am I an idler, liable to fall into bad habits? But he was eager to get to his work, a curious and intricate piece of analysis. So the battered bureau, the litter of papers, and the thick fume of his pipe engulfed him and absorbed him for the rest of the morning. Outside were the dim October mists, the dreary and languid life of a side street, and beyond, on the main road, the hum and jangle of the gliding trains. But he heard none of the uneasy noises of the quarter, not even the shriek of the garden gates, nor the yelp of the butcher on his round, for delight in his great task made him unconscious of the world outside. He had come by curious paths to this calm hermitage between Shepherd's Bush and Acton Vale. The golden weeks of the summer passed on in their enchanted procession, and Annie had not returned. Neither had she written. Lucian, on his side, sat apart, wondering why his longing for her were not sharper. As he thought of his raptures, he would smile faintly to himself, and wonder whether he had not lost the world, and Annie with it. In the garden of Avalonius, his sense of external things had grown dim and indistinct. The actual, material life seemed every day to become a show, a fleeting of shadows across a great white light. At last the news came that Annie Morgan had been married from her sister's house to a young farmer, to whom, it appeared, she had been long engaged, and Lucian was ashamed to find himself only conscious of amusement, mingled with gratitude. She had been the key that opened the shut palace, and he was now secure on the throne of ivory and gold. A few days after he had heard the news, he repeated the adventure of his boyhood. For the second time, he scaled the steep hillside and penetrated the matted brake. He expected violent disillusion, but his feeling was rather astonishment at the activity of boyish imagination. There was no terror nor amazement now in the green bulwarks, and the stunted undergrowth did not seem in any way extraordinary. Yet he did not laugh at the memory of his sensations. He was not angry at the cheat. Certainly it had been all illusion, all the heats and chills of boyhood. Its thoughts of terror were without significance. But he recognized that the illusions of the child only differed from those of the man in that they were more picturesque. Belief in fairies and belief in the stock exchange as bestowers of happiness were equally vain. But the latter form of faith was ugly as well as inept. It was better, he knew, and wiser, to wish for a fairy coach than to cherish longings for a well-appointed brougham and liveried servants. He turned his back on the green walls and the dark oaks without any feeling of regret or resentment. After a little while, he began to think of his adventures with pleasure. The ladder by which he had mounted had disappeared, but he was safe on the height. By the chance fancy of a beautiful girl, he had been redeemed from a world of misery and torture, the world of external things into which he had come, a stranger, by which he had been tormented. He looked back at a kind of vision of himself seen as he was a year before, a pitiable creature burning and twisting on the hot coals of the pit, crying lamentably to the laughing bystanders for but one drop of cold water wherewith to cool his tongue. He confessed to himself, with some contempt, that he had been a social being, depending for his happiness on the goodwill of others. He had tried hard to write, chiefly, it was true, from love of the art, but a little from a social motive. He had imagined that a written book and the praise of responsible journals would ensure him the respect of the country people. It was a quaint idea, and he saw the lamentable fallacies naked. In the first place, a painstaking artist in words was not respected by the respectable. Secondly, books should not be written with the object of gaining the goodwill of the landed and commercial interests. Thirdly, and chiefly, no man should in any way depend on another. From this utter darkness, from danger of madness, the ever dear and sweet Annie had rescued him. Very beautifully and fitly, as Lucian thought. She had done her work without any desire to benefit him. She had simply willed to gratify her own passion, and in doing this had handed it to him the priceless secret. And he, on his side, had reversed the process. Merely to make himself a splendid offering for the acceptance of his sweetheart, he had cast aside the vain world and had found the truth, which now remained with him, precious and enduring. And since the news of the marriage, he found that his worship of her had by no means vanished. Rather, in his heart was the eternal treasure of a happy love, untarnished and spotless. It would be like a mirror of gold without alloy, bright and lustrous forever. For Lucian, it was no defect in the woman that she was desirous and faithless. He had not conceived an affection for certain moral or intellectual accidents, but for the very woman. Guided by the self-evident axiom that humanity is to be judged by literature, and not literature by humanity, he detected the analogy between Lycidas and Annie. Only the dullard would object to the nauseous cant of the one, or to the indiscretions of the other. A sober critic might say that the man who could generalize Herbert and Laud, Donne and Herrick, Sanderson and Juxon, Hammond and Lancelot Andrews into our corrupted clergy must be either an imbecile or a scoundrel, or probably both. The judgment would be perfectly true, but as a criticism of Lycidas, it would be a piece of folly. In the case of the woman, one could imagine the attitude of the controversial lover, of the chevalier who, with his tongue in his cheek, reverences and respects all women, and coming home early in the morning writes a leading article on Saint English Girl. Lucian, on the other hand, felt profoundly grateful to the delicious Annie, because she had at precisely the right moment voluntarily removed her image from his way. He confessed to himself that, latterly, he had a little dreaded her return as an interruption. He had shivered at the thought that their relations would become what was so terribly called an intrigue or affair. There would be all the threadbare and common stratagems, the vulgarity of secret assignations, and an atmosphere suggesting the period of Mr. Thomas More and Lord Byron and cigars. Lucian had been afraid of all of this. He had feared lest love itself should destroy love. He considered that now, freed from the torrent of the body, leaving untasted the green water that makes thirst more burning, He was perfectly initiated in the true knowledge of the splendid and glorious love. There seemed to him a monstrous paradox in the assertion that there could be no true love without a corporeal presence of the beloved. Even the popular sayings of "absence makes the heart grow fonder" and "familiarity breeds contempt" witnessed to the contrary. He thought, sighing and with compassion, of the manner in which men are continually led astray by the cheat of the senses. In order that the unborn might still be added to the born, nature had inspired men with the wild delusion that the bodily companionship of the lover and the beloved was desirable above all things, and so, by the false show of pleasure, the human race was chained to vanity and doomed to an eternal thirst for the non-existent. Again and again he gave thanks for his own escape. He had been set free from a life of vice and sin and folly, from all the dangers and illusions that are most dreaded by the wise. He laughed as he remembered what would be the common view of the situation. An ordinary lover would suffer all the sting of sorrow and contempt. There would be grief for a lost mistress, and rage at her faithlessness, and hate in the heart. One foolish passion driving on another and driving the man to ruin. For what would be commonly called the real woman he now cared nothing. If he had heard that she had died in her farm in utter Gwent, he would have experienced only a passing sorrow, such as he might feel at the death of any one he had once known. But he did not think of the young farmer's wife as the real Annie. He did not think of the frost-bitten leaves in winter as the real Rose. Indeed, the life of many reminded him of the flowers, perhaps more especially of those flowers which to all appearances are for many years but dull and dusty clumps of green, and suddenly, in one night, burst into the flame of blossom, and fill all the misty lawns with odor, till the morning. It was in that night that the flower lived, not through the long, unprofitable years, and in that manner, many human lives, he thought, were born in the evening and dead before the coming of day. But he had preserved the precious flower in all its glory, not suffering it to wither in the hard light, but keeping it in a secret place, where it could never be destroyed. Truly now, and for the first time, he possessed Annie, as a man possesses the gold which he has dug from the rock and purged of its baseness. He was musing over these things when a piece of news, very strange and unexpected, arrived at the rectory. A distant, almost a mythical relative known from childhood as Cousin Edward in the Isles of Wight had died, and by some strange freak had left Lucian £2,000. It was a pleasure to give his father £500, and the rector of his side forgot for a couple of days to lean his head on his hand. For the rest of the capital, which was well invested, Lucian found he would derive something between £60 and £70 a year, and his old desires for literature and a refuge in the murmuring streets returned to him. He longed to be free from the incantations that surrounded him in the country, to work and live in a new atmosphere. And so, with many good wishes from his father, he came to the retreat in the waste places of London. He was in high spirits when he found the square, clean room, horribly furnished, in the by-street that branched from the main road and advanced in an unlovely sweep to the mud pits and the desolation that was neither town nor country. On every side, monotonous gray streets, each house the replica of its neighbor. To the east, an unexplored wilderness, north and west and south, the brick fields and market gardens, everywhere the ruins of the country, the tracks where sweet lanes had been, gangrened stumps of trees, the relics of hedges, here and there an oak stripped of its bark, white and haggard and leprous, like a corpse. And the air seemed always gray, and the smoke from the brick fields was gray. At first, he scarcely realized the quarter into which chance had led him. His only thought was of the great adventure of letters in which he proposed to engage, and his first glance round his bed-sitting room showed him that there was no piece of furniture suitable for his purpose. The table, like the rest of the suite, was of bird's-eye maple, but the maker seemed to have penetrated the druidic secret of the rocking stone. The thing was in a state of unstable equilibrium perpetually. For some days he wandered through the streets, inspecting the second-hand furniture shops, and at last, in a forlorn byway, found an old Japanese bureau, dishonored and forlorn, standing amongst rusty bedsteads, sorry china, and all the refuse of homes dead and desolate. The bureau pleased him in spite of its grime and grease and dirt. Inlaid mother of pearl, the gleam of lacquer dragons in red gold, and hints of curious design shone through the film of neglect and ill usage, and when the woman of the shop showed him the drawers and well and pigeonholes, he saw that it would be an apt instrument for his studies. The bureau was carried to his room and replaced the bird's-eye table under the gas jet. As Lucian arranged what papers he had accumulated, the sketches of hopeless experiments, shreds of tatters of stories begun but never completed, outlines of plots, 2 or 3 notebooks scribbled through and through with impressions of the abandoned hills. He felt a thrill of exultation at the prospect of work to be accomplished, of a new world all open before him. He set out on the adventure with a fury of enthusiasm. His last thought at night, when all the maze of streets was empty and silent, was of the problem, and his dreams ran on phrases. And when he awoke in the morning, he was eager to get back to his desk. He immersed himself in a minute, almost in a minute, almost a microscopic analysis of fine literature. It was no longer enough, as in the old days, to feel the charm and incantation of a line or a word. He wished to penetrate the secret, to understand something of the world's wonderful suggestion, all apart from the sense that seemed to him the differentia of literature, as distinguished from the long follies of character drawing, psychological analysis, and all the stuff that went to make the 3-volume novel of commerce. He found himself curiously strengthened by the change from the hills to the streets. There could be no doubt, he thought, that living a lonely life, interested only in himself and his own thoughts, he had become, in a measure, inhuman. The form of external things, black depths in woods, pools in lonely places, those still valleys curtained by hills on every side, sounding always with the ripple of their brooks, had become to him an influence like that of a drug, giving a certain peculiar color and outline to his thoughts. And from early boyhood there had been another strange flavor in his life, the dream of the old Roman world, those curious impressions that he had gathered from the white walls of Carmane and from the looming bastions of the fort. It was, in reality, the subconscious fancies of many years that had rebuilt the golden city, and had shown him the vine trellis and the marbles and the sunlight in the garden of Avalonius, and the rapture of love had made it all so vivid and warm with life that even now, when he let his pen drop, the rich noise of the tavern and the chant of the theater sounded above the murmur of the streets. Looking back, it was as much a part of his life as his school days, and the tessellated pavements were as real as the square of faded carpet beneath his feet. But he felt that he had escaped. He could now survey those splendid and lovely visions from without, as if he read of opium dreams, and he no longer dreaded a weird suggestion that had once beset him, that his very soul was being molded into the hills and passing into the black mirror of still water pools. He had taken refuge in the streets, in the harbor of a modern suburb, from the vague, dreaded magic that had charmed his life. Whenever he felt inclined to listen to the old wood whisper or to the singing of the fawns, he bent more earnestly to his work, turning a deaf ear to the incantations. In the curious labor of the bureau, he found refreshment that was continually renewed. He experienced again, and with a far more violent impulse, the enthusiasm that had attended the writing of his book a year or two before, and so, perhaps, passed from one drug to another. It was, indeed, with something of rapture that he imagined the great procession of years all to be devoted to the intimate analysis of words, to the construction of the sentence as if it were a piece of jewelry or mosaic. Sometimes, in the pauses of the work, he would pace up and down his cell, looking out of the window now and again and gazing for an instant into the melancholy street. As the year advanced, the days grew more and more misty, and he found himself the inhabitant of a little island wreathed about with the waves of a white and solemn sea. In the afternoon, the fog would grow denser, shutting out not only sight but sound. The shriek of the garden gates, the jangling of the tram bells echoed as if from a far way. Then there were days of heavy, incessant rain. He could see a gray, drifting sky and the drops plashing in the street, and the houses all dripping and saddened with wet. He cured himself of one great aversion. He was no longer nauseated at the sight of a story begun and left unfinished. Formerly, even when an idea rose in his mind bright and wonderful, he had always approached the paper with a feeling of sickness and dislike, remembering all the hopeless beginnings he had made. But now he understood that to begin a romance was almost a separate and special art, a thing apart from the story to be practiced with sedulous care. Whenever an opening scene occurred to him, he noted it roughly in a book, and he devoted many long winter evenings to the elaboration of these beginnings. Sometimes the first impression would yield only a paragraph or a sentence, and once or twice but a splendid and sonorous word which seemed to Lucian all dim and rich with unsurmised adventure. But often he was able to write 3 or 4 vivid pages, studying above all things the hint and significance of the words and actions, striving to work into the lines the atmosphere of expectation and promise, and the murmur of wonderful events to come. In this one department of his task, the labor seemed almost endless. He would finish a few pages and then rewrite them, using the same incident and nearly the same words, but altering that indefinite something which is scarcely so much style as manner or atmosphere. He was astonished at the enormous change that was thus effected, and often, though he himself had done the work, he could scarcely describe in words how it was done. But it was clear that in this art of manner or suggestion, lay all the chief secrets of literature, that by it all the great miracles were performed. Clearly, it was not style, for style in itself was untranslatable, but it was that high, theurgic magic that made the English Don Quixote roughly traduced by some Gervais, perhaps the best of all English books. And it was the same element that made the journey of Roderick Random to London so ostensibly a narrative of coarse jokes and common experiences and burlesque manners, told in no very choice diction, essentially a wonderful vision of the 18th century, carrying to one's very nostrils the aroma of the great North Road, iron-bound under black frost, darkened beneath shuddering woods, haunted by highwaymen, with an adventure waiting beyond every turn, and great old echoing inns in the midst of lonely winter lands. It was this magic that Lucian sought for his opening chapters. He tried to find that quality that gives to words something beyond their sound and beyond their meaning, that in the first lines of a book should whisper things unintelligible, but all significant. Often he worked for many hours without success, and the grim, wet dawn once found him still searching for hieroglyphic sentences, for words mystical, symbolic. On the shelves, in the upper part of his bureau, he had placed the books which, however various as to matter, seemed to have a part in this curious quality of suggestion, and in that sphere which might almost be called supernatural. To these books he often had recourse, when further effort appeared altogether hopeless, and certain pages of Coleridge and Edgar Allan Poe had the power of holding him in a trance of delight, subject to emotion and impressions which he knew to transcend altogether the realm of the formal understanding, such lines as bottomless vales and boundless floods, and chasms and caves and Titan woods, with forms that no man can discover, for the dews that drip all over, had for Lucian more than the potency of a drug, lulling him into a splendid waking sleep, every word being a supreme incantation. And it was not only his mind that was charmed by such passages, for he felt at the same time a strange and delicious bodily languor that held him motionless, without the desire or power to stir from his seat. And there were certain phrases in Kubla Khan that had such a magic that he would sometimes wake up, as it were, to the consciousness that he had been lying on the bed or sitting in the chair by the bureau, repeating a single line over and over again for 2 or 3 hours. Yet he knew perfectly well that he had not been really asleep. A little effort recalled a constant impression of the wallpaper, with its pink flowers on a buff ground, and of the muslin-curtained window, letting in the grey winter light. He had been some 7 months in London when this odd experience first occurred to him. The day opened dreary and cold and clear, with a gusty and restless wind whirling round the corner of the street and lifting the dead leaves and scraps of paper that littered the roadway into eddying, mounting circles, as if a storm of black rain were to come. Lucian had sat late the night before, and rose in the morning feeling weary and listless and heavy-headed. While he dressed, his legs dragged him as with weights, and he staggered and nearly fell in bending down to the mat outside for his tea tray. He lit the spirit lamp of the hearth with shaking, unsteady hands, and could scarcely pour out the tea when it was ready. A delicate cup of tea was one of his few luxuries. He was fond of the strange flavor of the green leaf, and this morning he drank the straw-colored liquid eagerly, hoping it would disperse the cloud of languor. He tried his best to coerce himself into the sense of vigor and enjoyment with which he usually began the day, walking briskly up and down and arranging his papers in order. But he could not free himself from depression. Even as he opened the dear bureau, a wave of melancholy came upon him, and he began to ask himself whether he were not pursuing a vain dream, searching for treasures that had no existence. He drew out his cousin's letter and read it again, sadly enough. After all, there was a good deal of truth in what she said. He had overrated his powers. He had no friends, no real education. He began to count up the months since he had come to London. He had received his £2,000 in March, and in May he had said goodbye to the woods and to the dear and friendly paths. May, June, July, August, September, October, November, and half of December had gone by. And what had he to show? Nothing but the experiment, the attempt. Futile scribblings which had no end nor shining purpose. There was nothing in his desk that he could produce as evidence of his capacity, no fragment even of accomplishment. It was a thought of intense bitterness, but it seemed as if the barbarians were in the right. A place in a house of business would have been more suitable. He leaned his head on his desk, overwhelmed with the severity of his own judgment. He tried to comfort himself again by the thought of all the hours of happy enthusiasm he had spent amongst his papers, working for a great idea with infinite patience. He recalled to mind something that he had always tried to keep in the background of his hopes, the foundation stone of his life, which he had hidden out of sight. Deep in his heart was the hope that he might one day write a valiant book. He scarcely dared to entertain the aspiration. He felt his incapacity too deeply, but yet this longing was the foundation of all his painful and patient effort. This he had proposed in secret to himself, that if he labored without ceasing, without tiring, he might produce something which would at all events be art, which would stand wholly apart from the objects shaped like books, printed with printer's ink and called by the name of books that he had read. Giotto, he knew, was a painter, and the man who imitated walnut wood on the deal doors opposite was a painter, and he had wished to be a very humble pupil in the class of the former. It was better, he thought, to fail in attempting exquisite things than to succeed in the department of the utterly contemptible. He had vowed he would be the dunce of Cervantes' school rather than the top boy in the academy of A Bad Un to Beat and Millicent's Marriage, and with this purpose he had devoted himself to laborious and joyous years, so that however mean his capacity, the pains should not be wanting. He tried now to rouse himself from a growing misery by the recollection of his high aim, but it all seemed hopeless vanity. He looked out into the gray street, and it stood a symbol of his life, chill and dreary and gray, and vexed with a horrible wind. There were the dull inhabitants of the quarter going about their common business. A man was crying "mackerel" in a doleful voice, slowly passing up the street and staring into the white-curtained parlors, searching for the face of a purchaser behind the India rubber plants, stuffed birds, and piles of gaudy gilt books that adorned the windows. One of the blistered doors over the way banged, and a woman came scurrying out on some errand, and the garden gate shrieked two melancholy notes as she opened it and let it swing back after her. The little patches called gardens were mostly untiled, uncared for, squares of slimy moss, dotted with clumps of coarse, ugly grass, but here and there were the blackened and rotting remains of sunflowers and marigolds. And beyond, he knew, stretched the labyrinth of streets more or less squalid, but all gray and dull. And beyond were the mud pits and the steaming heaps of yellowish bricks, and to the north was a great, wide, cold waste, treeless, desolate, swept by bitter wind. It was all like his own life, he said again to himself, a maze of unprofitable dreariness and desolation, and his mind grew as black and hopeless as the winter sky. The morning went thus dismally till 12 o'clock, and he put on his hat and great coat. He always went out for an hour every day between 12 and 1. The exercise was a necessity, and the landlady made his bed in the interval. The wind blew the smoke from the chimneys into his face as he shut the door, and with the acrid smoke came the prevailing odor of the street, a blend of cabbage water and burnt bones and the faint, sickly vapor from the brick fields. Lucian walked mechanically for the hour, going eastward along the main road. The wind pierced him, and the dust was blinding, and the dreariness of the street increased his misery. The row of common shops, full of common things, the blatant public houses, the independent chapel, a horrible stucco parody of a Greek temple with a facade of hideous columns that was a nightmare, villas like smug Pharisees, shops again, a church in cheap Gothic, an old garden blasted and riven by the builder. These were the pictures of the way. When he got home again, he flung himself on the bed and lay there stupidly till sheer hunger roused him. He ate a hunch of bread and drank some water, and began to pace up and down the room, wondering whether there were no escape from despair. Writing seemed quite impossible, and hardly knowing what he did, he opened his bureau and took out a book from the shelves. As his eyes fell on the page, the air grew dark and heavy as night, and the wind wailed suddenly, loudly, terribly. By woman wailing for her demon lover. The words were on his lips when he raised his eyes again. A broad band of pale, clear light was shining into the room, and when he looked out of the window, he saw the road all brightened by glittering pools of water, and as the last drops of the rainstorm starred these mirrors, the sun sank into the rack. Lucian gazed about him, perplexed, till his eyes fell on the clock above his empty hearth. He had been sitting, motionless, for nearly 2 hours without any sense of the passage of time, and without ceasing he had murmured those words as he dreamed an endless, wonderful story. He experienced somewhat the sensation of Coleridge himself. Strange, amazing, ineffable things seemed to have been presented to him, not in the form of the idea, but actually and materially. But he was less fortunate than Coleridge in that he could not, even vaguely, image to himself what he had seen. Yet when he searched his mind, he knew that the consciousness of the room in which he sat had never left him. He had seen the thick darkness gather, and had heard the whirl of rain hissing through the air. Windows had been shut down with a crash. He had noted the pattering footsteps of people running to shelter, the landlady's voice crying to someone to look at the rain coming in under the door. It was like peering into some old bituminous picture. One could see at last that the mere blackness resolved itself into the likeness of trees and rocks and travelers. And against this background of his room, and the storm, and the noises of the street, his vision stood out illuminated. He felt he had descended to the very depths, into the caverns that are hollowed beneath the soul. He tried, vainly, to record the history of his impressions. The symbols remained in his memory, but the meaning was all conjecture. The next morning, when he awoke, he could scarcely understand or realize the bitter depression of the preceding day. He found it had all vanished away, and had been succeeded by an intense exultation. Afterwards, when at rare intervals he experienced the same strange possession of the consciousness, he found this to be the invariable result. The hour of vision was always succeeded by a feeling of delight, by sensations of brightened and intensified powers. On that bright December day after the storm, he rose joyously and set about the labor of the bureau with the assurance of success, almost with the hope of formidable difficulties to be overcome. He had long busied himself with those curious researches which Poe had indicated in the Philosophy of Composition, and many hours had been spent in analyzing the singular effects which may be produced by the sound and resonance of words. But he had been struck by the thought that in the finest literature there were more subtle tones than the loud and insistent music of nevermore, and he endeavored to find the secret of those pages and sentences which spoke less directly and less obviously to the soul rather than to the ear, being filled with a certain grave melody and the sensation of singing voices. It was admirable, no doubt, to write phrases that showed at a glance their designed rhythm and rang with sonorous words, but he dreamed of a prose in which the music should be less explicit, of names rather than notes. He was astonished that morning at his own fortune and facility. He succeeded in covering a page of ruled paper wholly to his satisfaction, and the sentences, when he read them out, appeared to suggest a weird, elusive chanting, exquisite but almost imperceptible, like the echo of the plain song reverberated from the vault of a monastic church. He thought that such happy mornings well repaid him for the anguish of depression which he sometimes had to suffer, and for the strange experience of possession recurring at rare intervals, and usually after many weeks of severe diet. His income, he found, amounted to £65 a year, and he lived for weeks at a time on 15 shillings a week. During these austere periods, his only food was bread, at the rate of a loaf a day. But he drank huge draughts of green tea and smoked a black tobacco, which seemed to him a more potent mother of thought than any drug from the scented East. "I hope you go to some nice place for dinner," wrote his cousin. "There used to be some excellent eating houses in London where one could get a good cut from the joint, with plenty of gravy, and a boiled potato for a shilling. And Mary writes that you should try Mr. Jones's in Water Street, Islington, whose father came from near Caerman, and was almost most comfortable in her day. I dare say the walk there would do you good. It is such a pity you smoke that horrid tobacco. I had a letter from Mrs. Dolly, Jane Diggs, who married your cousin John Dolly, the other day, and she said that they would have been delighted to take you for only 25 shillings a week for the sake of the family, if you had not been a smoker. She told me to ask you if you had ever seen a horse or a dog smoking tobacco. They are such nice, comfortable people, and the children would have been company for you. Johnny, who used to be such a dear little fellow, has just gone into an office in the city and seems to have excellent prospects. How I wish, my dear Lucian, that you could do something in the same way. Don't forget Mr. Jones's in Water Street, and you might mention your name to him." Lucian never troubled Mr. Jones, but these letters of his cousin's always refreshed him by the force of contrast. He tried to imagine himself a part of the Dolly family, going dutifully every morning to the city on the bus, and returning in the evening for high tea. He could conceive the fine odor of hot roast beef hanging about the decorous house on Sunday afternoons, Papa asleep in the dining room, Mama lying down, and the children quite good and happy in their Sunday's books. In the evening, after supper, one would read The Quiver till bedtime. Such pictures of these were to Lucian a comfort and a help, a remedy against despair. Often, when he felt overwhelmed by the difficulty of the work he had undertaken, he thought of the alternative career, and was strengthened. He returned again and again to that desire of a prose which should sound faintly, not so much with an audible music, but with the memory and echo of it. In the night, when the last tram had gone jangling by, and he had looked out and seen the street all wrapped about in heavy folds of the mist, he conducted some of his most delicate experiments. In that white and solitary midnight of the suburban street, he experienced the curious sense of being on a tower, remote and apart, and high above all the troubles of the earth. The gas lamp, which was nearly opposite, shone in a pale halo of light, and the houses themselves were merely indistinct marks and shadows amidst that palpable whiteness, shutting out the world and its noises. The knowledge of the swarming life that was so still, though it surrounded him, made the silence seem deeper than that of the mountains before the dawn. It was as if he alone stirred and looked out amidst a host sleeping at its feet. The fog came in by the open window in freezing puffs, and as Lucian watched, he noticed that it shook the wavered, like the sea, tossing up wreaths and drifts across the pale halo of the lamp, and, these vanishing, others succeeded. It was as if the mist passed by from the river to the north, as if it still passed by in the silence. He would shut his window gently and sit down in his lighted room with all the consciousness of the white advancing shroud upon him. It was then that he found himself in the mood for curious labors, and able to handle with some touch of confidence the more exquisite instruments of the craft. He sought for that magic by which all the glory and glamour of mystic chivalry were made to shine through the burlesque and gross adventures of Don Quixote, by which Hawthorne had lit his infernal Sabbath fires, and fashioned a burning aureole about the village tragedy of the Scarlet Letter. In Hawthorne, the story and the suggestion, though quite distinct and of different worlds, were rather parallel than opposite to one another. But Cervantes had done a stranger thing. One read of Don Quixote, beaten, dirty, and ridiculous, making windmills for giants, sheep for an army. But the impression was of the enchanted forest, of Avalon, of the San Graal, far in the spiritual city. And Rebelus showed him, beneath the letter, the Tauranian sun shining on the hot rock above Chinon, on the maze of narrow, climbing streets, on the high-pitched, gabbled roofs, on the gray-blue torals, pricking upward from the fantastic labyrinth of walls. He heard the sound of sonorous plain-song from the monastic choir, of gross, exuberant gaiety from the rich vineyards. He listened to the eternal mystic mirth of those that halted in the purple shadow of the Sorbier by the white, steep road, the gracious and ornate chateau on the Loire and the Vigne rose fair and shining to confront the incredible secrets of vast, dim, far-lifted Gothic naves that seemed ready to take the great deep and float away from the mist and dust of earthly streets to anchor in the haven of the clear city that hath foundations. The rank tale of the garderobe, of the farm kitchen, mingled with the reasoned endless legend of the schools, with luminous Platonic argument. The old pomp of the Middle Ages put on the robe of a fresh life. There was a smell of wine and of incense, of June meadows and of ancient books, and through it all he hearkened, intent, to the exultation of chiming bells ringing for a new feast in a new land. He would cover pages with the analysis of these marvels, tracking the suggestion concealed beneath the words, and yet glowing like the golden threads in a robe of samite, or like that device of the old binders by which a vivid picture appeared on the shut edges of a book. He tried to imitate this art, to summon even the faint shadow of the great effect, rewriting a page of Hawthorne, experimenting and changing in epithet here and there, noting how sometimes the alteration of a trifling word would plunge a whole scene into darkness, as if one of those blood-red fires had instantly been extinguished. Sometimes, for severe practice, he attempted to construct short tales in the manner of this or that master. He sighed over these desperate attempts, over the clattering pieces of mechanism which would not even stimulate life, but he urged himself to an infinite perseverance. Through the white hours he worked on amidst the heap and litter of papers. Books and manuscripts overflowed with the bureau to the floor, and if he looked out he saw the mist still pass by, still passing from the river to the north. It was not till the winter was well advanced that he began at all to explore the region in which he lived. Soon after his arrival in the gray streets, he had taken 1 or 2 vague walks, hardly noticing where he went or what he saw. But but for all the summer he had shut himself in his room, beholding nothing but the form and color of words. For his morning walk, he almost invariably chose the one direction, going along the Uxbridge Road towards Notting Hill, and returning by the same monotonous thoroughfare. Now, however, when the new year was beginning its dull days, he began to diverge occasionally to right and left, sometimes eating his luncheon in odd corners, in the bulging parlors of 18th-century taverns, and still fronted the surging sea of modern streets, or perhaps in brand-new publics on the broken borders of the brick fields, smelling of the clay from which they had swollen. He found waste by-places behind railway embankments, where he could smoke his pipe sheltered from the wind. Sometimes there was a wooden fence by an old pear orchard where he sat and gazed at the wet desolation of the market gardens, munching a few currant biscuits by way of dinner. As he went further afield, a sense of immensity slowly grew upon him. It was as if, from the little island of his room, that one friendly place, he pushed out into the grey unknown, into a city that for him was uninhabited as the desert. He came back to his cell after these purposeless wanderings, always with a sense of relief, with the thought of taking refuge from grey. As he lit the gas and opened the desk of his bureau and saw the pile of papers awaiting him, it was as if he had passed from the black skies and the stinging wind and the dull maze of the suburb into all the warmth and sunlight and violent color of the South. End of chapter 5. Da-da-da-da-da. Okay, chapter 5. I've said many things about what I love about this, but the picture that we're getting of Lucian is wonderful, and it is very much still relevant today. So Lucian is a struggling writer. He has gone into a field that does not guarantee that you make money, and people are like, you are a fool. You're a fool. And he is living on bread and tobacco and drinking tea, and I feel like that is still very relatable to any sort of like struggling artist. Like it's the ramen diet, you know? And we are getting his process, his organization, his walks, and on the walks every once in a while he gets a little inspiration that he needs to remember for later. And in this, he's also reading other works that he deems as being wonderful. He's reading Cervantes, he's reading Hawthorne, he's reading any number of things, and doing different writing exercises, like writing as different authors and how they would write this specific thing to sort of like jog his memory. And he's also not afraid of having unfinished works. If something isn't working for him, he's able to put it aside and maybe come back to it later. And I am just loving the descriptions and the vibiness and the just of it all. It's such good writing. It makes writing like in art, and like language as in art, and really showcases that, and really is like praising it. And I think it's wonderful. I think it's so good. I'm a nerd. I'm a nerd. All right, chapter 6. It was in this winter, after his coming to the Grey Street, that Lucian first experienced the pains of desolation. He had all his life known the delights of solitude, and had acquired that habit of mind which makes a man find rich company on the bare hillsides, and leads him into the heart of the wood to meditate by the dark water pools. But now, in the blank interval when he was forced to shut up his desk, the sense of loneliness overwhelmed him and filled him with unutterable melancholy. On such days, he carried about with him in unceasing gnawing torment in his breast. The anguish of the empty page awaiting him in his bureau, and the knowledge that it was worse than useless to attempt the work. He had fallen into the habit of always using the phrase, the work, to denote the adventure of literature. It had grown in his mind to all the austere and grave significance of the great work on the lips of the alchemists. It included every trifling and laborious page and the vague magnificent fancies that sometimes hovered below him. All else had become mere byplay, unimportant, trivial. The work was the end, and the means and the food of his life. It raised him up in the morning to renew the struggle. It was the symbol which charmed him as he lay down at night. All through the hours of toil at the bureau he was enchanted, and when he went out and explored the unknown coasts, the one thought allured him, and was the colored glass between his eyes and the world. Then, as he drew nearer home, his steps would quicken, and the more weary and gray the walk, the more he rejoiced as he thought of his hermitage and of the curious difficulties that awaited him there. But when, suddenly and without warning, the faculty disappeared, when his mind seemed a hopeless waste from which nothing could arise, then he became subject to a misery so piteous that the barbarians themselves would have been sorry for him. He had known some foretaste of these bitter and inexpressible griefs in the old country days, but then he had immediately taken refuge in the hills. He had rushed to the dark woods as to an anodyne, letting his heart drink in all the wonder and magic of the wild land. Now, in these days of January, in the suburban street, there was no such refuge. He had been working steadily for some weeks, well enough satisfied on the whole with the daily progress, glad to awake in the morning and to read over what he had written on the night before. The new year opened with faint and heavy weather and a breathless silence in the air, but in a few days the great frost set in. Soon the streets began to suggest the appearance of a beleaguered city. The silence that had preceded the frost deepened, and the mist hung over the earth like a dense white smoke. Night after night, the cold increased, and people seemed unwilling to go abroad, till even the main thoroughfares were empty and deserted, as if the inhabitants were lying close in hiding. It was at this dismal time that Lucian found himself reduced to impotence. There was a sudden break in his thought, and when he wrote on valiantly, hoping against hope, he only grew more aghast on the discovery of the imbecilities he had committed to paper. He ground his teeth together and persevered, sick at heart, feeling as if all the world were fallen from under his feet, driving his pen on mechanically till he was overwhelmed. He saw the stuff he had done without veil or possible concealment, a lamentable and wretched sheaf of verbiage, worse, it seemed, than the efforts of his boyhood. He was not longer tautological. He avoided tautology, but the infernal art of a leader writer, filling his windbags and mincing words as if he had been a trained journalist on the staff of the Daily Post. There seemed all the matter of an insufferable tragedy in these thoughts, that his patient and enduring toil was in vain, that practice went for nothing, and that he had wasted the labor of Milton to accomplish the 10th rate. Unhappily, he could not give in. The longing, the fury for the work burnt within him like a burning fire. He lifted up his eyes in despair. It was then, while he knew that no one could help him, that he languished for help. And then, Though he was aware that no comfort was possible, he fervently wished to be comforted. The only friend he had was his father, and he knew that his father would not even understand his distress. For him, always, the printed book was the beginning and end of literature, the agony of the maker. His despair and sickness were as accursed as the pains of labor. He was ready to read and admire the work of the great smith, but he did not wish to hear of the period when the great smith had writhed and twisted like a scotched worm, only hoping to be put out of his misery, to go mad or die, to escape somehow from the bitter pains. And Lucian knew no one else. Now and then he read in the paper the fame of the great littérateurs. The travellers were entertaining the Prince of Wales, the jolly beggars were dining with the Lord Mayor, the old mumpers were mingling amicably and gorgeously with the leading members of the Stock Exchange. He was so unfortunate as to know none of these gentlemen, but it hardly seemed likely that they could have done much for him in any case. Indeed, in his heart, he was certain that help and comfort from without were in the nature of things utterly impossible. His ruin and grief were within, and only his own assistance could avail. He tried to reassure himself, to believe that his torments were a proof of his vocation, that the facility of the novelist who stood 6 years deep in contracts to produce romances was a thing wholly undesirable. But all the while he longed for but a drop of that inexhaustible fluency which he professed to despise. He drove himself out from that dreary contemplation of the white paper and the idle pen. He went into the frozen and deserted streets, hoping that he might pluck the burning coal from his heart, but the fire was not quenched. As he walked furiously along the grim iron roads, he fancied that those persons who passed him cheerfully on their way to friends and friendly hearths shrank from him into the mists as they went by. Lucian imagined that the fire of his torment and anguish must in some way glow visibly about him. He moved, perhaps, in a nimbus that proclaimed the blackness and the flames within. He knew, of course, that in misery he had grown delirious, that the well-coded, smooth-hatted personages who loomed out of the fog upon him were in reality shuddering only with cold. But in spite of common sense, he still conceived that he saw on their faces an evident horror and disgust, and something of the repugnance that one feels at the sight of a venomous snake half-killed, trailing its bleeding vileness out of sight. By design, Lucian tried to make for remote and desolate places, and yet, when he had succeeded in touching on the open country and knew that the icy shadow hovering through the mist was a field, he longed for some sound and murmur of life, and turned again to roads where pale lamps were glimmering and the dancing flame of firelight shone across the frozen shrubs. And the sight of these homely fires, the thought of affection and consolation waiting by them, stung him the more sharply perhaps because of the contrast with his own chills and weariness and helpless sickness, and chiefly because he knew that he had long closed an everlasting door between his heart and such facilities. If those within had come out and had called him by his name to enter and be comforted, it would have been quite unavailing, since between them and him there was a great gulf fixed. Perhaps for the first time he realized that he had lost the art of humanity forever. He had thought when he closed his ears to the wood whisper and changed the fawns singing for the murmur of the streets, the black pools for the shadows and amber light of London, that he had put off the old life and had turned his soul to healthy activities. But the truth was that he had merely exchanged one drug for another. He could not be human. and he wondered whether there were some drop of the fairy blood, in his body, that made him foreign and a stranger to the world. He did not surrender to desolation without repeated struggles. He strove to allure himself to his desk by the promise of some easy task. He would not attempt invention, but he had memoranda and rough jottings of ideas in his notebooks, and he would merely amplify the suggestions ready to his hand. But it was hopeless. Again and again, it was hopeless. As he read over his notes, trusting that he would find some hint that might light up the dead fires and kindle again that pure flame of enthusiasm, he found how desperately his fortune had fallen. He could see no light, no color in the lines he had scribbled with eager, trembling fingers. He remembered how splendid all these things had been when he wrote them down, but now they were meaningless, faded into gray. The few words he had dashed onto paper, enraptured at the thought of the happy hours they promised, had become mere jargon, and when he understood the idea, it seemed foolish, dull, unoriginal. He discovered something at last that appeared to have a grain of promise, and determined to do his best to put it into shape. But the first paragraph appalled him. It might have been written by an unintelligent schoolboy. He tore the paper in pieces and shut and locked his desk, heavy despair sinking like the lead into his heart. For the rest of that day, he lay motionless on the bed, smoking pipe after pipe in the hope of stupefying himself with tobacco fumes. The air in the room became blue and thick with smoke. It was bitterly cold, and he wrapped himself up in his great coat and drew the counterpane over him. The night came on, and the window darkened, and at last he fell asleep. He renewed the effort at intervals, only to plunge deeper into misery. He felt the approaches of madness, and knew that his only hope was to walk till he was physically exhausted, so that he might come home almost fainting with fatigue, but ready to fall asleep the moment he got into bed. He passed the mornings in a kind of torpor, endeavoring to avoid thought, to occupy his mind with the pattern of the paper, with the advertisements at the end of a book, with the curious grayness of the light that glimmered through the mist into his room, with the muffled voices that rumbled now and then from the street. He tried to make out the design that had once colored the faded carpet on the floor, and wondered about the dead artist in Japan, the adorner of his bureau. He speculated as to what his thoughts had been as he inserted the rainbow mother of pearl and made that great flight of shining birds, dipping their wings as they rose from the reeds, or how he had conceived the lacquer dragons in red gold, and the fantastic houses in the garden of peach trees. But sooner or later, the oppression of his grief returned, the loud shriek and clang of the garden gate, the warning bell of some passing bicyclist steering through the fog, the noise of his pipe falling to the floor, would suddenly awaken him to the sense of his misery. He knew that it was time to go out. He could not bear to sit still and suffer. Sometimes he cut a slice of bread and put it in his pocket. Sometimes he trusted to the chance of finding a public house where he could have a sandwich and a glass of beer. He turned always from the main streets and lost himself in the intricate suburban byways, willing to be engulfed in the infinite whiteness of the mist. The roads had stiffened into iron ridges. The fences and trees were glittering with frost crystals. Everything was of strange and altered aspect. Lucian walked on and on through the maze, now in a circle of shadowy villas, awful as the buried streets of the Herculaneum, now in lanes dipping onto open country, that led him past great elm trees, whose white branches were all still, and past the bitter, lonely fields where the mist seemed to fade away into gray darkness. As he wandered along these unfamiliar and ghastly paths, he became the more convinced of his utter remoteness from all humanity. He allowed that grotesque suggestion of there being something visibly amiss in his outward appearance to grow upon him, and often he looked with a horrible expectation into the faces of those who passed by, afraid lest his own senses gave him false intelligence, and that he had really assumed some frightful and revolting shape. It was curious that, partly by his own fault, and largely, no doubt, through the operation of mere coincidence, he was, once or twice, strongly confirmed in this fantastic delusion. He came one day into a lonely and unfrequented byway, a country lane falling into ruin, but still fringed with elms that had formed an avenue leading to the old manor house. It was now the road of communication between two far outlying suburbs, and on these winter nights lay as black, dreary, and desolate as a mountain track. Soon after the frost began, a gentleman had been set upon in this lane as he picked his way between the corner where the bus had set him down and his home where the fire was blazing, and his wife watched the clock. He was stumbling uncertainly through the gloom, growing a little nervous because the walk seemed so long, and peering anxiously for the lamp at the end of his street, when the two footpads rushed at him out of the fog. One caught him from behind, the other struck him with a heavy bludgeon, and as he lay senseless, they robbed him of his watch and money, and vanished across the fields. The next morning all the suburb rang with the story. The unfortunate merchant had been grievously hurt, and wives watched their husbands go out into the morning with sickening apprehension, not knowing what might happen at night. Lucian, of course, was ignorant of all these rumors, and struck into the gloomy by-road without caring where he was, or whither the way would lead him. He had been driven out that day as with whips. Another hopeless attempt to return to the work had agonized him, and existence seemed an intolerable pain. As he entered the deeper gloom where the fog hung heavily, he began, half-consciously, to gesticulate. He felt convulsed with torment and shame, and it was a sorry relief to clench his nails into his palm and strike the air as he stumbled heavily along, bruising his feet against the frozen ruts and ridges. His impotence was hideous, he said to himself, and he cursed himself and his life, breaking out into a loud oath and stamping on the ground. Suddenly he was shocked at a scream of terror. It seemed in his very ear, and looking up he saw for a moment a woman gazing at him out of the mist, her features distorted and stiff with fear. A momentary convulsion twitched her arms into the ugly mimicry of a beckoning gesture, and she turned and ran for dear life, howling like a beast. Lucian stood still in the road while the woman's cries grew faint and died away. His heart was chilled within him as the significance of this strange incident became clear. He remembered nothing of his violent gestures. He had only known at the time that he had sworn out loud, or that he was grinding his teeth with impotent rage. He only thought of that ringing scream, of the horrible fear on the white face that had looked upon him, of the woman's headlong flight from his presence. He stood, trembling and shuddering, and in a little while he was feeling his face, searching for some loathsome mark, for the stigmata of evil branding his forehead. He staggered homeward like a drunken man, and when he came into the Uxbridge road, some children saw him and called after him as he swayed and caught at the lamp-post. When he got to his room, he sat down at first in the dark. He did not dare to light the gas. Everything in the room was indistinct, but he shut his eyes as he passed the dressing table and sat in a corner, his face turned to the wall. And when at last he gathered courage and the flame leaped hissing from the jet, he crept piteously towards the glass and ducked his head, crouching miserably and struggling with his terrors before he could look at his own image. To the best of his power, he tried to deliver himself from these more grotesque fantasies. He assured himself that there was nothing terrific in his countenance but sadness, that his face was like the face of other men. Yet he could not forget that reflection he had seen in the woman's eyes, how the surest mirrors had shown him a horrible dread, her soul itself quailing and shuddering at an awful sight. Her scream rang and rang in his ears. She had fled away from him as if he offered some fate darker than death. He looked again and again into the glass, tortured by a hideous uncertainty. His senses told him there was nothing amiss, yet he had had a proof, and yet, as he peered most earnestly, there was, it seemed, something strange and not altogether usual in the expression of the eyes. Perhaps it might be the unsteady flare of the gas, or perhaps a flaw in the cheap looking-glass that gave some slight distortion to the image. He walked briskly up and down the room and tried to gaze steadily, indifferently, into his own face. He would not allow himself to be misguided by a word. When he had pronounced himself incapable of humanity, he had only meant that he could not enjoy the simple things of common life. A man was not necessarily monstrous merely because he did not appreciate high tea, a quiet chat about the neighbors, and a happy, noisy evening with the children. But with that message, then, did he appear charged that the woman's mouth grew so stark. Her hands had jerked up as if they had been pulled with frantic wires. She seemed for the instant like a horrible puppet. Her scream was a thing from the nocturnal Sabbath. He lit a candle and held it close up to the glass so that his own face glared white at him, and the reflection of the room became an indistinct darkness. He saw nothing but the candle flame and his own shining eyes, and surely they were not as the eyes of common men. As he put down the light, a sudden suggestion entered his mind, and he drew a quick breath, amazed at the thought. He hardly knew whether to rejoice or to shudder. For the thought he conceived was this, that he had mistaken all the circumstances of the adventure, and had perhaps repulsed a sister who would have welcomed him to the Sabbath. He lay awake all night, turning from one dreary and frightful thought to the other, scarcely dozing for a few hours when the dawn came. He tried for a moment to argue with himself when he got up, knowing that his true life was locked up in a bureau. He made a desperate attempt to drive the phantoms and hideous shapes from his mind. He was assured that his salvation was in the work, and he drew the key from his pocket and made as if he would have opened the desk. But the nausea, the remembrances of repeated and utter failure, were too powerful. For many days he hung about the Manor Lane, half dreading, half desiring another meeting, and he swore he would not again mistake the cry of rapture, nor repulse the arms extended in a frenzy of delight. In those days he dreamed of some dark place where they might celebrate and make the marriage of the Sabbath, with such rites as he had dared to imagine. It was perhaps only the shock of a letter from his father that rescued him from these evident approaches to madness. Mr. Taylor wrote how they had missed him at Christmas, how the farmers had inquired after him, of the homely, familiar things that recalled his boyhood, his mother's voice, the friendly fireside, and the good old fashions that had nurtured him. He remembered that he had once been a boy, loving the cake and puddings, and the radiant holly, and all the 17th century mirth that lingered on in the ancient farmhouses. and there came to him the more holy memory of Mass on Christmas morning. How sweet the dark and frosty earth had smelt as he walked beside his mother down the winding lane, and from the stile near the church they had seen the world glimmering to the dawn and the wandering lanthorns advancing across the fields. Then he had come into the church and seen it shining with candles and holly, and his father in pure vestments of white linen sang the longing music of the liturgy at the altar, and the people answered him, till the sun rose with the grave notes of the paternoster, and the red beam stole through the chancel window. The worst horror left him as he recalled the memory of these dear and holy things. He cast away the frightful fancy that the scream he had heard was a shriek of joy, that the arms, rigidly jerked out, invited him to an embrace. Indeed, the thought that he had longed for such an obscene illusion, that he had gloated over the recollection of that stark mouth, filled him with disgust. He resolved that his senses were deceived, that he had neither seen nor heard, but had for a moment externalized his own slumbering and morbid dreams. It was perhaps necessary that he should be wretched, that his efforts should be discouraged, that he would not yield utterly to madness. Yet, when he went abroad with such good resolutions, it was hard to resist an influence that seemed to come from without and within. He did not know it, but people were everywhere talking of the great frost, of the fog that lay heavy on London, making the streets dark and terrible, of strange birds that came fluttering about the window in the silent squares. The Thames rolled out duskily, bearing down the jarring ice blocks, and as one looked on the black water from the bridges, it was like a river in a northern tale. To Lucian, it all seemed mythical, of the same substance as his own fantastic thoughts. He rarely saw a newspaper, and did not follow from day to day the systematic readings of the thermometer, the reports of ice fairs, of coaches driven across the river at Hampton, of the skating on the fens, and hence the iron roads. The beleaguered silence and the heavy folds of mist appeared as amazing as a picture, significant, appalling. He could not look out and see a common suburban street foggy and dull, nor think of the inhabitants as at work or sitting cheerfully eating nuts about their fires. He saw a vision of a gray road vanishing, of dim houses all empty and deserted, and the silence seemed eternal. And when he went out and passed through street after street, all void by the vague shapes of houses that appeared for a moment and were then instantly swallowed up, it seemed to him as if he had strayed into a city that had suffered some inconceivable doom, that he alone wandered where myriads had once dwelt. It was a town as great as Babylon, terrible as Rome, marvelous as lost Atlantis, set in the midst of a white wilderness surrounded by waste places. It was impossible to escape from it. If he skulked between hedges and crept away beyond the frozen pools, presently the serried stony lines confronted him like an army, and far they swept away into the night, as some fabled wall that guards an empire in the vast, dim east, or in that distorted medium of the mist, changing all things. He imagined that he trod an infinite, desolate plain, abandoned from ages, but circled and encircled with dolmen and menhir that loomed out at him, gigantic, terrible. All London was one grey temple of an awful rite, ring within ring of wizard stones, circled about some central place. Every circle was an initiation, every initiation eternal loss. Or perhaps he was astray forever in a land of grey rocks. He had seen the light of home, the flicker of the fire on the walls. Close at hand, it seemed, was the open door, and he had heard dear voices calling to him across the gloom, but he had just missed the path. The lamps vanished. The voices sounded thin and died away, and yet he knew that those within were waiting, that they could not bear to close the door, but waited, calling his name, while he had missed the way and wandered in the pathless desert of the gray rocks. Fantastic, hideous, they beset him wherever he turned, piled up into strange shapes, pricked with sharp peaks, assuming the appearance of goblin towers, swelling into a vague dome like a fairy wrath, huge and terrible. And as one dream faded into another, so these last fancies were perhaps the most tormenting and persistent. The rocky avenues became the camp and fortalice of some half-human, malignant race who swarmed in hiding, ready to bear him away into the heart of their horrible hills. It was awful to think that all his goings were surrounded, that in the darkness he was watched and surveyed, that every step but led him deeper and deeper into the labyrinth. When, of an evening, he was secure in his room, the blind drawn down and the gas flaring, he made vigorous efforts toward sanity. It was not of his free will that he allowed terror to overmaster him, and he desired nothing better than a placid and harmless life, full of work and clear thinking. He knew that he deluded himself with imagination, that he had been walking through London suburbs and not through pandemonium, and that if he could but unlock his bureau, all those ugly forms would be resolved into the mist. But it was hard to say if he consoled himself effectually with such reflections, for the return to common sense meant also the return to the sharp pangs of defeat. It recalled him to the bitter theme of his own inefficiency, to the thought that he only desired one thing of life, and that this was denied him. He was willing to endure the austerities of a monk in a severe cloister, to suffer cold, to be hungry, to be lonely and friendless, to forbear all the consolation of friendly speech, and to be glad of all these things, if only he might be allowed to illuminate the manuscript in quietness. It seemed a hideous, insufferable cruelty that he should so fervently desire that which he could never gain. He was led back to the old conclusion. He had lost the sense of humanity. He was wretched because he was an alien and a stranger amongst citizens. It seemed probable that the enthusiasm of literature, as he understood it, the fervent desire for the fine art, had in it something of the inhuman, and dissevered the enthusiast from his fellow creatures. It was possible that the barbarian suspected as much, that by some slow process of rumination he had arrived at his fixed and inveterate impression, by no means a clear reasoned conviction. The average Philistine, if pressed for the reasons of his dislike, would either become inarticulate, ejaculating "Faugh!" and "Pah!" like an old-fashioned Scots magazine, or else he would give some imaginary and absurd reason, alleging that all literary men were poor, that composers never cut their hair, that painters were rarely public school men, that sculptors couldn't ride straight to hounds to save their lives. But clearly, these imbecilities were mere afterthoughts. The average man hated the artist from a deep, instinctive dread of all that was strange, uncanny, alien to his nature. He gibbered, uttered his harsh, semi-bestial "Faugh!" and dismissed Keats to his gallipots from much the same motives as usually impelled the black savages to dismiss the white man on an even longer journey. Lucian was not especially interested in this hatred of the barbarian for the maker, except from this point, that it confirmed him in his belief that the love of art dissociated the man from the race. One touch of art made the whole world alien. But surely miseries of the civilized man cast amongst savages were not so much caused by dread of their ferocity as by the terror of his own thoughts. He would perhaps, in his last despair, leave his retreat and go forth to perish at their hands, so that he might at least die in company and hear the sound of speech before death. And Lucian felt most keenly that in his case there was a double course. He was as isolated as Keats, and as inarticulate as his reviewers. The consolation of the work had failed him, and he was suspended in the void between two worlds. It was, no doubt, the composite effect of his failures, his loneliness of soul and solitude of life, that had made him invest those common streets with such grim and persistent terrors. He had perhaps yielded to a temptation without knowing that he had been tempted, and, in the manner of De Quincey, had chosen the subtle in exchange for the more tangible pains. Unconsciously, but still of free will, he had preferred the splendor and the gloom of a malignant vision before his corporeal pains, before the hard reality of his own impotence. It was better to dwell in vague melancholy, to stray in the forsaken streets of a city doomed from ages, to wander amidst forlorn and desperate rocks, than to awake to a gnawing and ignoble torment, to confess that a house of business would have been more suitable and more practical, that he had promised what he could never perform. Even as he struggled to beat back the phantasmagoria of the mist, and resolved that he would no longer make all the streets a stage of apparitions, he hardly realized what he had done, or that the ghosts he had called might depart and return again. He continued his long walks, always with the object of producing a physical weariness and exhaustion that would enable him to sleep of nights. But even when he saw the foggy and deserted avenues in their proper shape, and allowed his eyes to catch the pale glimmer of the lamps and the dancing flame of the firelight, he could not rid himself of the impression that he stood afar off, that between those hearths and himself there was a great gulf fixed. As he paced down the footpaths, he could often see plainly across the frozen shrubs into the homely and cheerful rooms. Sometimes, late in the evening, he caught a passing glimpse of the family at tea, father, mother, and children laughing and talking together, well pleased with each other's company. Sometimes a wife or a child was standing by the garden gate peering anxiously through the fog, and the sight of it all the little details, the hideous but comfortable armchairs turned ready to the fire, maroon red curtains being drawn close to shut out the ugly night, the sudden blaze and illumination as the fire was poked up so that it might be cheerful for father. These trivial and common things were acutely significant. They brought back to him the image of a dead boy, himself. They recalled the shabby old parlor in the country, with its shabby old furniture and fading carpet, and renewed a whole atmosphere of affection and homely comfort. His mother would walk to the end of the drive and look out for him when he was late, wandering then about the dark woodlands. On winter evenings, she would make the fire blaze and have his slippers warming by the hearth, and there was probably buttered toast as a treat. He dwelt on all these insignificant, petty circumstances, on the genial glow and light after the muddy winter lanes, on the relish of the buttered toast and the smell of the hot tea, on the two old cats curled fast asleep before the fender and made them instruments of exquisite pain and regret. Each of these strange houses that he passed was identified in his mind with his own vanished home, All was prepared and ready, as in the old days. But he was shut out, judged, and condemned to wander in the frozen mist with weary feet, anguished and forlorn, and they that would pass from within to help him could not, neither could he pass to them. Again, for the 100th time, he came back to the sentence. He could not gain the art of letters, and he had lost the art of humanity. He saw the vanity of all his thoughts. He was an ascetic, caring nothing for warmth and cheerfulness and the small comforts of life, and yet he allowed his mind to dwell on such things. If one of those passers-by who walked briskly, eager for home, should have pitied him by some miracle and asked him to come in, it would have been worse than useless. Yet he longed for pleasure that he could not have enjoyed. It was as if he were come to a place of torment, where they could not drink, longed for water, where they who could feel no warmth shuddered in the eternal cold. He was oppressed by the grim conceit that he himself still slept within the matted thicket, imprisoned by the green bastions of the Roman fort. He had never come out, but a changeling had gone down the hill, and now stirred about the earth. Beset by such ingenious terrors, it was not wonderful that outward events and common incidents should abet his fancies. He had succeeded one day in escaping from the mesh of the streets, and fell on a rough and narrow lane that stole into a little valley. For the moment he was in a somewhat happier mood. The afternoon sun glowed through the rolling mist, and the air grew clearer. He saw quiet and peaceful fields, and a wood descending in a gentle slope from an old farmstead of warm red brick. The farmer was driving the slow cattle home from the hill, and his loud "Hello!" to his dog came across the land, a cheerful, mellow note. From another side, a cart was approaching the clustered barns, hesitating, pausing while the great horses rested, and then starting again into lazy motion. In the well of the valley, a wandering line of bushes showed where a brook crept in and out amongst the meadows, and, as Lucian stood, lingering on the bridge, a soft and idle breath ruffled through the boughs of a great elm. He felt soothed, as by calm music, and wondered whether it would not be better for him to live in some such quiet place, within reach of the streets and yet remote from them. It seemed a refuge for still thoughts. He could imagine himself sitting at rest beneath the black yew tree in the farm garden at the close of a summer day. He had almost determined that he would knock at the door and ask if they would take him as a lodger, when he saw a child running towards him down the lane. It was a little girl, with bright curls tossing about her head, and as she came on, the sunlight glowed upon her, illuminating her brick-red frock and the yellow kingcups of her hat. She had run with her eyes on the ground, chirping and laughing to herself, and did not see Lucian till she was quite near him. She started, and glanced into his eyes for a moment, and began to cry. He stretched out his hand, and she ran from him, screaming, frightened, no doubt, by what was to her a sudden and strange apparition. He turned back towards London, and the mist folded him in its thick darkness, for on that evening it was tinged with black. It was only by the intensest strain of resolution that he did not yield utterly to the poisonous anodyne which was always at hand. It had been a difficult struggle to escape from the mesh of the hills, from the music of the fawns, and even now he was drawn by the memory of these old allurements. But he felt that here, in his loneliness, he was in greater danger, and beset by a blacker magic. Horrible fancies rushed wantonly into his mind. He was not only ready to believe that something in his soul sent a shudder through all that was simple and innocent, but he came trembling home one Saturday night, believing, or half believing, that he was in communion with evil. He had passed through the clamorous and blatant crowd of the high street, where, as one climbed the hill, the shops seemed all aflame, and the black night air glowed with the flaring gas jets and the naphtha lamps, hissing and wavering before the February winds. Voices, raucous, clamant, abominable, were belched out of the blazing public houses as the doors swung to and fro, and above these doors were hideous, brassy lamps, very slowly swinging in a violent blast of air, so that they might have been infernal thuribles sensing the people. Some man was calling his wares in one long, continuous shriek that never stopped or paused, and, as a respond, a deeper, louder voice roared to him from across the road. An Italian whirled the handle of his piano organ in a fury, and a ring of imps danced mad figures around him, danced and flung up their legs till the rags dropped from some of them, and they still danced on. A flare of naphtha, burning with a rushing noise, threw a light on one point of the circle, and Lucian watched a lank girl of 15 as she came round and round to the flash. She was quite drunk, and had kicked her petticoats away, and the crowd howled laughter and applause at her. Her black hair poured down and leaped on her scarlet bodice. She sprang and leaped round the ring, laughing in Bacchic frenzy, and led the orgy to triumph. People were crossing to and fro, jostling against each other, swarming about certain shops and stalls in a dense, dark mass that quivered and sent out feelers as if it were one writhing organism. A little farther, a group of young men, arm in arm, were marching down the roadway, chanting some music hall verse in full chorus, so that it sounded like plain song, an impossible hubbub, a hum of voices angry as swarming bees, the sequels of 5 or 6 girls who ran in and out, and dived up dark passages and darted back into the crowd. All these mingled together till his ears quivered. A young fellow was playing the concertina, and he touched the keys with such slow fingers that the tune wailed solemn into a dirge. But there was nothing so strange as the burst of sound that swelled out when the public house doors were opened. He walked amongst these people, looked at their faces, and looked at the children amongst them. He had come out thinking that he would see the English working class, the best behaved and the best tempered crowd in the world, enjoying the simple pleasure of the Saturday night's shopping. Mother bought the joint for Sunday's dinner, and perhaps a pair of boots for father. Father had an honest glass of beer, and the children were given bags of sweets, and then all these worthy people went decently home to their well-earned rest. De Quincey had enjoyed the sight of his day, and had studied the rise and fall of onions and potatoes. Lucian, indeed, had desired to take these simple emotions as an opiate, to forget the fine fret and fantastic trouble of his own existence in plain things, and the palpable joy of rest after labor. He was only afraid lest he should be too sharply reproached by the sight of these men who fought bravely year after year against starvation, who knew nothing of intricate and imagined grief, but only the weariness of relentless labor, of the long battle of their wives and children. It would be pathetic, he thought, to see them content with so little, brightened by the expectation of a day's rest and a good dinner, forced, even then, to reckon every penny, and to make their children laugh with halfpence. Either he would be ashamed before so much content, or else he would be again touched by the sense of his inhumanity, which could take no interest in the common things of life. But still, He went to be at least taken out of himself, to be forced to look at another side of the world so that he might perhaps forget a little while his own sorrows. He was fascinated by what he saw and heard. He wondered whether De Quincey also had seen the same spectacle and had concealed his impressions out of reverence for the average reader. Here, there were no simple joys of honest toilers, but wonderful orgies that drew out his heart to horrible music. At first, the violence of sound and sight had overwhelmed him, the lights flaring in the night wind, the array of naphtha lamps, the black shadows, the roar of voices. The dance about the piano organ had been the first sign of an inner meaning, and the face of the dark girl as she came round and round to the flame had been amazing in its utter, furious abandon. And what songs they were singing all around him, and what terrible words rang out, only to excite peals of laughter. In the public houses, the workmen's wives, the wives of small tradesmen, decently dressed in black, were drinking their faces to a flaming red, and urging their husbands to drink more. Beautiful young women, flushed and laughing, put their arms round the men's necks and kissed them, and then held up the glass to their lips. In the dark corners, at the openings of side streets, the children were talking together, instructing each other, whispering what they had seen. A boy of 15 was plying a girl of 12 with whiskey, and presently they crept away. Lucian passed them as they turned to go, and both looked at him. The boy laughed, and the girl smiled quietly. It was above all in the faces around him that he saw the most astounding things, the Bacchic fury unveiled and unashamed. To his eyes, it seemed as if these revelers recognized him as a fellow and smiled up in his face, aware that he was in secret. Every instinct of religion, of civilization even, was swept away. They gazed at one another and at him, absolved of all scruples, children of the earth and nothing more. Now and then a couple detached themselves from the swarm, and even away into the darkness, answering the jeers and laughter of their friends as they vanished. On the edge of the pavement, not far from where he was standing, Lucian noticed a tall and lovely young woman who seemed to be alone. She was in the full light of a naphtha flame, and her bronze hair and flushed cheeks shone illuminate as she viewed the orgy. She had dark brown eyes, and a strange look as of an old picture in her face, and her eyes brightened with an urgent gleam. She saw the revelers nudging each other and glancing at her, and 2 or 3 young men went up and asked her to come for a walk. She shook her head and said, "No, thank you," again and again, and seemed as if she were looking for somebody in the crowd. "I'm expecting a friend," she said, at last to a man who proposed a drink and a walk afterwards, and Lucian wondered what kind of friend would ultimately appear. Suddenly she turned to him as he was about to pass on and said in a low voice, "I'll go for a walk with you, if you like. You just go on, and I'll follow in a minute." For a moment he looked steadily at her. He saw that the first glance had misled him. Her face was not flushed with drink, as he had supposed, but it was radiant with the most exquisite color. A red flame glowed and died on her cheek, and seemed to palpitate as she spoke. The head was set on the neck nobly, as in a statue, and about the ears the bronze hair strayed into little curls. She was smiling and waiting for his answer. He muttered something about being very sorry, and fled down the hill out of the orgy from the noise of roaring voices and the glitter of the great lamps very slowly swinging in the blast of wind. He knew that he had touched the brink of utter desolation. There was death in the woman's face, and she had indeed summoned him to the Sabbath. Somehow, he had been able to refuse on the instant, but if he had delayed, he knew he would have abandoned himself to her, body and soul. He locked himself in his room and lay trembling on the bed, wondering if some subtle sympathy had shown the woman her perfect companion. He looked in the glass, not expecting now to see certain visible and outward signs, but searching for the meaning of that strange glance that lit up his face. He had grown even thinner than before in the last few months, and his cheeks were wasted with hunger and sorrow. But there were still about his features the suggestion of a curious classic grace, and the look as of a faun who has strayed from the vineyards and olive gardens. He had broken away, but now he felt the mesh of her net about him, a desire for her that was a madness, as if she drew every nerve in his body and drew him to her mystic world, to the rose bush where every flower was aflame. He dreamed all night of the perilous things he had refused, and it was loss to awake in the morning, pain to return to the world. The frost had broken and the fog had rolled away, and the gray street was filled with a clear gray light. Again, he looked out on the long, dull sweep of the monotonous houses, hidden for the past weeks by a curtain of mist. Heavy rain had fallen in the night, and the garden rails were still dripping, the roofs still dark with wet. All down the line, the dingy white blinds were drawn in the upper windows. Not a soul walked the street. Everyone was asleep after the exertions of the night before. Even on the main road, it was only at intervals that some straggler paddled by. Presently, a woman in brown ulster shuffled off on some errand. Then a man in shirt sleeves poked out his head, holding the door half open, and stared up at a window opposite. After a few minutes, he slunk in again, and 3 loafers came slouching down the street, eager for mischief or beastliness of some sort. They chose a house that seemed rather smarter than the rest, and, irritated by the neat curtains, the little grass plot with its dwarf shrub, one of the ruffians drew out a piece of chalk and wrote some words on the front door. His hands kept watch for him, and the adventure achieved, all 3 bolted, bellowing Yahoo laughter. Then a bell began. Tang, tang, tang. And here and there children appeared on their way to Sunday school, and the chapel teachers went by with verjuice eyes and lips, scowling at the little boy who cried, "Piper, Piper!" on the main road. Many respectable people, the men shining and ill-fitted, the women hideously bedizened, passed in the direction of the independent nightmare, the stuccoed thing with Doric columns, but on the whole life was stagnant. Presently Lucian smelt the horrid fumes of roast beef and cabbage. The early risers were preparing the 1 o'clock meal, but many lay in bed and put off dinner till 3, with the effect of prolonging the cabbage atmosphere into the late afternoon. A drizzly rain began as the people were coming out of church, and the mothers of little boys in velvet and little girls in foolishness of every kind were impelled to slap their offering and to threaten them with father. Then the torpor of beef and beer and cabbage settled down on the street. In some houses they snorted and read the parish magazine. In some they snorted and read the murders and collected filth of the week. But the only movement of the afternoon was a second procession of children, now bloated and distended with food, again answering the summons of tang, tang, tang. On the main road, the trams, laden with impossible people, went humming to and fro. And young men who wore bright blue ties cheerfully haw-hawed and smoked penny cigars. They annoyed the shiny and respectable and verjuice-lipped, but not by the frightful stench of the cigars, but because they were cheerful on Sunday. By and by the children, having heard about Moses in the bulrushes and Daniel in the lion's den, came straggling home in an evil humor. And all the day it was as if on a gray sheet gray shadows flickered, passing by. And in the rose garden every flower was aflame. He thought in symbols, using the Persian imagery of a dusky court surrounded by white cloisters, gilded by gates of bronze. The stars came out. The sky glowed a darker violet, but the cloistered wall, the fantastic trellises in stone, shone whiter. It was like a hedge of May blossom, like a lily within a cup of lapis lazuli, like sea foam tossed on the heaving sea at dawn. Always those white cloisters trembled with the lute music. Always the garden sang with the clear fountain rising and falling in the mysterious dusk. And there was a singing voice stealing through the white lattices and the bronze gates, a soft voice chanting of the lover and the beloved, of the vineyard, of the gate and the way. Oh, the language was unknown, but the music of the refrain returned again and again, swelling and trembling through the white nets of the latticed cloisters, and every rose in the dusky air was aflame. He had seen the life which he expressed by these symbols offered to him, and he had refused it, and he was alone in the gray street, with its lamps just twinkling through the dreary twilight, the blast of a ribald chorus sounding from the main road, a doggerel hymn whining from some parlor to the accompaniment of the harmonium. He wondered why he had turned away from that woman who knew all secrets, in whose eyes were all the mysteries. He opened the desk of his bureau and was confronted by the heap and litter of papers lying in confusion as he had left them. He knew that there was the motive of his refusal. He had been unwilling to abandon all hope of the work. The glory and the torment of his ambition glowed upon him as he looked at the manuscript. It seemed so pitiful that such a single desire should be thwarted. He was aware that if he chose to sit down now before the desk, he could, in a manner, write easily enough. He could produce a tale which would be formally well constructed and certain of favorable reception, and it would not be the utterly commonplace, entirely hopeless favorite of the circulating library. It would stand in those ranks where the real thing of skillfully counterfeited, amongst the books which give the reader his orgy of emotions, and yet contrive to be superior and art in his opinion. Lucian had often observed this species of triumph, and had noted the acclamation that never failed the clever sham. Romola, for example, had made the great host of the serious, the portentous, shout for joy, while the real book, The Cloister and the Hearth, was a comparative failure. He knew that he could write a Romola, but he thought the art of counterfeiting half-crowns less detestable than this shabby trick of imitating literature. He had refused definitely to enter the atelier of the gentleman who pleased his clients by ingeniously simulating the grain of walnut. And though he had seen the old oaken ambry kicked out contemptuously into the farmyard, serving perhaps the necessities of hens or pigs, he would not apprentice himself to the masters of veneer. He paced up and down the room, glancing now and again at his papers, and wondering if there were not hope for him. A great thing he could never do, but he had longed to do a true thing, to imagine sincere and genuine pages. He stirred again to this fury for the work by the event of the evening before, by all that had passed through his mind since the melancholy dawn, the lurid picture of that fiery street, the flaming shops and flaming glances, all its wonders and horrors, lit by the naphtha flares and by the burning souls, had possessed him, and the noises, the shriek and the whisper, the jangling rattle of the piano organ, the long continued scream of the butcher as he dabbled in the blood, the lewd litany of the singers. These seemed to be resolved into an infernal overture, loud with the expectation of lust and death. And how the spectacle was set in the cloud of dark night, a phantom play acted on that fiery stage, beneath those hideous brassy lamps, very slowly swinging in a violent blast. As all the medley of outrageous sights and sounds now fused themselves within his brain into one clear impression, it seemed that he had indeed witnessed and acted in a drama, that all the scene had been prepared and vested for him, and that the choric songs he had heard were but preludes to a greater act. For in that woman was the consummation and catastrophe of it all, and the whole stage waited for their meeting. He fancied that after this the voices and the lights died away, that the crowd sank swiftly into the darkness, and that the street was at once denuded of the great lamps and of all its awful scenic apparatus. Again, he thought, the same mystery would be represented before him. Suddenly, on some dark and gloomy night, as he wandered lonely on a deserted road, the wind hurrying before him, suddenly a turn would bring him again upon the fiery stage, and the antique drama would be reenacted. He would be drawn to the same place, to find that woman still standing there. Again, he would watch the rose radiant and palpitating upon her cheek, the argent gleam in her brown eyes, the bronze curls gilding the white splendor of her neck, and for the second time she would freely offer herself. He could hear the wail of the singers swelling to a shriek, and see the dusky dancers whirling round in a faster frenzy, and the naphtha flares tinged with red, as the woman and he went away into the dark, into the cloistered court, where every flower was aflame, whence he would never come out. His only escape was in the desk. He might find salvation if he could again hide his heart in the heap and litter of papers, and again be wrapped by the cadence of a phrase. He threw open his window and looked out on the dim world and the glimmering amber lights. He resolved that he would rise early in the morning and seek once more for his true life in the work. But there was a strange thing. There was a little bottle on the mantelpiece, a bottle of dark blue glass, and he trembled and shuddered before it, as if it were a fetish. End of chapter 6. All right, chapter 6. Okay, something that I love so much, at least what I take away, which we've talked about before, like you could read this a million times and find a million different things in this within the writing itself, but then also like different meanings and such. But something that like I took away is like, okay, through Lucian's like evolution of this story, he has been lost in his mind and lost in his writing and almost flailing and not really having like sturdy ground to be on, not having a compass that is necessarily guiding him or anything like that. But then also through his writing, he is able to make sense of a world. He's able to make sense of his surroundings and see things differently than before he became so engrossed in language and literature and all of the like crazy mental turns and flips that he did. And I think that that is great. And like the whole discussion of him like losing his humanity and being like no longer part of, you know, this world or this realm or anything like that is just really cool. Like the way that I read it, which I am not in any way a scholar of Machen or about, you know, this type of literature or anything like that, but I just see it as being like, okay, I'm not just like a regular person anymore. I don't see things that like mundane things are like so almost like romanticized to him. Like when we were talking about like him walking down and he would look into the sitting room of a house and see a family, and like we see that all the time. But like the things that he's noticing are just so interesting and so specific, and the way that he's describing them are just so internalized, and I think that that is wonderful. And then it like harkens to like his own memory, and then being like, okay, so maybe I didn't need to run away from who I was and where I was to London searching for something. It was already there. And now that I'm here in London, it's like, is what I'm looking for going to be here? Probably. But it was also over here. So I think that that is also really cool. Like being able to see things differently in different perspectives because of the different studyings and the different, how many more times can I say different in a sentence? And the routes that he has taken, I think is fascinating. And also just the way that he is looking at, you know, the night at the town, the night on the town in the pub. He's not looking at it as being like a participant. He's very much seeing himself as an outsider and observing the life of these people. And I think that that is also interesting too. Like he's not seeing himself as fitting in, and he doesn't necessarily, at this point anyway, feel like he needs to fit in. Like he's accepted that he's not. And I think that that's really cool. I like that. There's like this one chapter you could spend weeks on discussing. I'm not going to, but you could. But you definitely could. Chapter 6 is your favorite so far. Amazing, amazing. The convergence of his fantasies, isolation, and despair is so well done. Yes, yeah. And it's such like universal too. Like, yeah, it's very specific to his own experiences and his own, you know, world, but who hasn't accidentally isolated themselves for whatever reason, like intentionally or unintentionally, and then like realized it, or, you know, just been like so in your head that you're not realizing like what is actually happening, you know, or like you're already having conversations, or you know how somebody's going to respond to something that you bring up, and it's just like all in your head, and it's like, okay, well maybe if we like let people in a little bit, which is scary, totally get it, but then maybe, you know, you'll have that common ground and you'll lose that isolation, at least for a little bit. And I think that that's great. And yeah, the despair of, you know, like being a fake, a fraud, going a different path that isn't highly looked on. Interesting. But that's where we're going to end it today. We have one more chapter, but that's it for tonight. Thank you all so much for being here. It was a pleasure. It was a pleasure. As always, whether you lurk, whether you chat, I 1000% appreciate you. And I 1000% appreciate your support. If I don't see you next time, I'll see you very soon. Bye.